This is the terrifying reality of a mother facing bankruptcy and losing her children to slavery, turned upside down by a single room of borrowed oil. We love the grand miracles of the Bible. We love the stories where seas are split wide open, where stone walls crumble to dust under the blast of trumpets, and where fire falls from heaven to consume altars in the sight of thousands. These are the epic moments that fill our minds with wonder. But the Bible is also a book of small rooms, dim corners, and private heartbreaks. It is a book about ordinary people whose emergencies don't happen on battlefields, but at the kitchen table. People who aren't fighting empires, but are fighting the cold, hard reality of starvation. Imagine a mother standing in a house that has been stripped bare. Imagine her listening to the heavy footsteps approaching her front door, knowing exactly who is coming, and knowing she has absolutely nothing left to give them. She wasn't a queen. She wasn't a prophetess. She was simply a widow, left with 2 sons, a mountain of unpayable debt, and a system that showed no mercy. In that dark hour, everything she loved was about to be torn away. She could give up and let the darkness consume her family, or she could bring her emptiness to the only one who held the power of breath. The choice she made would reveal a profound truth about how God operates when human resources completely dry up. This is her story.
Now, hold on. Before we get into her story, smash that like button and subscribe for more content like this.
Long before this widow faced her crisis, the northern kingdom of Israel was caught in a deep spiritual tug-of-war. King Ahab and his ruthless queen, Jezebel, had established the worship of Baal as the national religion. They hunted down the true prophets of God, trying to silence their voices forever. But in the shadows, a powerful movement of resistance was growing. The prophet Elijah, and later his successor Elisha, established communities known as the Sons of the Prophets. These were groups of young men who dedicated their lives to studying the law, preserving the true worship of Yahweh, and standing firm against the cultural decay around them. The widow's husband had been one of these men. He wasn't a famous leader whose name is recorded in the genealogies. He was a regular student of the prophetic schools, an ordinary man who chose a dangerous path of faithfulness. He had served the Lord with reverence, choosing poverty and persecution over the comforts of the royal palace. But faithfulness does not make a person immortal. Disease or sudden tragedy struck, and the young prophet died. When a husband died in ancient Israel, the grief was only the beginning of a woman's trial. In that ancient culture, a woman's financial security, legal standing, and social protection were entirely tied to the men in her life. Without a husband, a woman was instantly cast into a state of extreme vulnerability. There were no insurance policies. There were no government safety nets. There were no bank accounts to draw from. And this husband had left behind something far worse than an empty house. He had left behind debt. We do not know why he owed money. Perhaps in those days of famine and economic oppression under wicked kings, buying simple grain to keep his family alive required borrowing silver. Perhaps his dedication to the ministry kept him from working standard, lucrative trades. Whatever the reason, the debt was real, the interest was high, and the silver was gone. And in ancient times, the laws governing debt were brutal. If a man died owing money, his debt did not die with him. It transferred directly to his family. Under the legal system of the ancient Near East, a creditor had the legal right to seize a debtor's property to satisfy what was owed. And if the debtor had no property, no land, and no gold, the creditor could seize the most valuable asset the family possessed: their children. The knock came at the door. The creditor arrived, not with words of sympathy for her loss, but with cold demands for payment. He looked at the widow's 2 young sons. To the mother, these boys were her entire world, the legacy of her late husband and her only hope for the future. But to the creditor, they were merely commodities. They were pieces of labor that could be bought, sold, and worked to pay off a balance sheet. The creditor delivered his ultimatum: pay the silver, or the 2 boys would be taken away to serve as slaves. According to the strict legal boundaries of the time, the boys would have to work as indentured servants for years. perhaps until the year of Jubilee, enduring hard labor under the authority of a stranger. The widow's house was already silent from grief. Now, it was about to be stripped of its laughter, its strength, and its joy. The widow didn't stay inside to weep. She didn't let despair paralyze her. Instead, she ran to find Elisha, the man of God who led the prophetic community. She found him and cried out, her voice heavy with the raw agony of a mother on the brink of losing everything. "Your servant, my husband, is dead," she said, "and you know that your servant feared the Lord. But now the creditor is coming to take my 2 boys to be his slaves." Notice her plea. She didn't boast of her own righteousness. She pointed to the quiet faithfulness of her deceased husband. She was saying, he stood for God when it was dangerous. Will God stand for us now? She was holding God to his own promises to protect the fatherless and the widow. Elisha looked at this broken woman. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He didn't tell her to go home and just pray harder. He asked her 2 direct questions. How can I help you? Tell me, what do you have in your house? The question must have felt like a cruel joke to a woman whose home had been completely emptied by poverty. She looked back at her life, at the bare shelves, at the cold hearth, and answered, "Your servant has nothing there at all, except a small jar of olive oil." Nothing at all, except a small jar. It was a tiny flask of oil, likely the lowest grade, used for cooking a final meal or perhaps anointing a body. It was completely insignificant compared to the massive debt hanging over her head. It was a drop of resource in an ocean of liability. But in the economy of God, a little bit of nothing is the exact raw material required for a breakthrough. Then Elisha gave her a set of instructions that defied all human logic. "Go around and ask all your neighbors for empty jars," Elisha told her. "Don't ask for just a few. Then go inside, shut the door behind you and your sons, and pour oil into all those jars, setting each one aside as it is filled." Imagine the faith required to execute this command. The widow had to walk down the dirt streets of her village, knocking on the doors of her neighbors, asking to borrow their empty vessels. The neighbors would have looked at her with pity and confusion. Why does the poor widow need 50 empty jars? She doesn't even have enough food to fill a single bowl. She had to endure the whispers, the curious glances, and the public shame of her poverty. But she did it. She and her sons gathered the jars. Large jars, small jars, clay pots, and stone vessels. They carried them back into their small house, loading them onto the floor until the room was packed with emptiness. Then, she did the most critical thing. She shut the door. The miracle was not meant for the public square. It was not a show for the curious onlookers or a spectacle for the cynical neighbors. It was a sacred transaction between a desperate family and a faithful God. Behind that closed door, away from the doubts of the world, her faith became isolated with God's power. She stood over the empty vessels, holding her tiny, insignificant jar of oil. Her son stood beside her, watching intently. She tipped the small flask over the first large neighbor's jar. A golden stream of oil began to flow. It flowed out of the small jar and into the large vessel. The oil hit the bottom of the clay pot, rising higher and higher. The widow watched, expecting the small flask to run dry at any moment, but the stream didn't sputter. It didn't stop. The oil kept coming. The first jar was filled to the brim. "Bring me another one," she whispered to her son. He slid an empty pot into place. She tilted her hand again. The oil poured, and poured, and poured. The second jar filled, then the third, then the fourth. Her small container had become an artesian well of abundance, defying the laws of physics, flowing from an invisible source that never ran dry. Her sons worked quickly, moving the filled heavy pots away and replacing them with empty ones. The air in the small room grew thick with the rich, sweet scent of fresh olive oil. The darkness of the house was pushed back by the golden liquid reflecting the dim lamplight. Finally, the widow tilted her hand again and said to her son, "Bring me another jar." But the boy looked around the room at the sea of full vessels and replied, "There is not a jar left." And the moment there was no more space for the oil to fill, the scripture records a profound detail. Then the oil stopped flowing. The oil didn't run out because God's grace was exhausted. The oil stopped because there were no more empty vessels to receive it. The limitation was not in the supply. The limitation was in the capacity. The widow stood in a room packed with wealth. She left her house and ran back to Elisha, her face illuminated with a joy that had seemed impossible just hours before. She told the man of God what had happened. Elisha looked at her and gave the final order. Go, sell the oil and pay your debts. You and your sons can live on what is left. The miracle did not just patch her problem. It completely overwhelmed it. She had enough to satisfy the ruthless creditor, stopping his footsteps at the door and securing the absolute freedom of her sons. And beyond that, she had a surplus, a financial foundation that would sustain her family in the days ahead. The night that started with the terrifying threat of slavery ended with the sweet taste of total liberation. The story of the prophet's widow is a beautiful historical snapshot of divine rescue, but it is also a mirror for our modern lives. We live in a culture that is deeply terrified of emptiness. We spend our lives trying to ensure that every container of our life is overflowing. We try to keep our bank accounts full, our schedules full, our social feeds full, and our minds constantly occupied. We treat emptiness as a sign of failure, a symptom of lack, or a source of deep shame. And yet, many of us feel exactly like that widow. We feel stripped bare by life. We are emotionally spent, financially overwhelmed, or spiritually exhausted. We look at our resources, our energy, our intelligence, and our patience, and we say, I have nothing at all. We carry debts that aren't written on paper, debts of guilt, cycles of anxiety, habits we can't break, and the heavy weight of expectations we can never satisfy. We hear the enemy of our souls knocking at the door, demanding payment, trying to enslave our thoughts, our peace, and our children. But this story changes the entire perspective on our lack. God did not ask the widow to pretend she was full. He didn't ask her to manufacture oil out of her own willpower. He asked her to gather emptiness. The great truth of the kingdom is that God does not pour into vessels that are already full of themselves. He looks for the empty spaces, your area of greatest weakness, your season of deepest grief, your moment of total financial or emotional bankruptcy. That is not where God abandons you. That is the exact space where He sets up His workshop. When you bring your empty jar to God and say, I have nothing left, you aren't disqualifying yourself from a miracle. You are preparing the vessel. But notice the condition. You have to borrow jars, and you have to shut the door. In our modern world, when trouble hits, our first instinct is to open the door to the public square. We open our screens. We vent our frustrations online. We look for validation from strangers, and we fill our minds with the noisy opinions of a world that has no oil to give us. We try to solve our spiritual droughts with shallow, temporary fixes that leave us more hollow than before. The widow reminds us to go inside. Shut out the noise of the critics. Shut out the voices of the creditors who say you will never make it. Shut out the panic of the marketplace. Get alone with the Father in secret, behind closed doors, and begin to pour out what little you have left, your raw prayers, your tears, your broken praise, and your small, faltering steps of obedience. And as you pour, you will discover what thousands of believers have discovered across centuries, that His grace is sufficient, His supply is relentless, and His love will keep pouring until every empty space in your heart is filled with His presence. He is not a distant accountant waiting to foreclose on your life. He is the Redeemer who walks directly into your bankruptcy, pays the price you could never afford, and hands you a future of complete freedom. The question is simple. Do you have any empty jars to bring Him today?